Good morning, everyone. To everyone who's joining us virtually, I hope you're all safe and well. And a good morning and welcome to our panelists for our session today on working in the city, livelihoods, mobility, and space. Um, Today we have an hour and a half of looking at various presentations that explore the complexities and challenges of being an economic actor in our cities at different scales and for different kinds of actors. So we have an excellent spread of issues that we'll hear about today. Starting at looking at two presentations on migration, exploring the socio-aspirational reasons why people migrate, to the different spatial practices and placemaking activities of migrant women. Following that, looking at the conditions of work women are in the formal labor market, and how COVID is forcing us to reimagine the dualities and binaries that have animated our understanding of urbanization and its economics so far. And finally, we'll have a presentation looking at the nature of economic activity created by state-mediated or development-oriented social entrepreneurship. I'm really fascinated by all of these abstracts that I read, and I'm looking forward to hearing the full presentations from our scholars, and also looking forward to hearing how various aspects of the urban and economic get pulled apart, and how some of our assumed hypotheses about this relationship between metropolitan smaller cities and economies get challenged by our grounded research. So I want to dive straight into the presentations. A few housekeeping notes before that for the audience joining us and for our panelists. We'll have just under an hour of presentations from all of our panelists, and I'll try and offer some questions and comments at the end of each presentation, which we can take up at the end in about half an hour or 20 minutes. But for everyone joining us online, please do use the Q&A box to ask questions as people are presenting or after presentations. And panelists, please do respond in the Q&A, or we can take up some of the questions that you find interesting at the end and talk about and discuss those. We'll be following the schedule that was posted as part of the conference proceedings. So we'll be starting with Tirthankar Chakraborty, whose presentation is titled Traveling the Cosmos, Exploring Urban Sensibility Amongst the Rural Cosmopolitans in Hyderabad. So Tirthankar, I invite you to please put your camera on and lead us through your presentation. Thank you. You're on mute.
Yes, just the clinks in the virtual mode. Thank you, Aditi. First, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from wherever you are joining. I will just take a second to share my screen. I hope this is working.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. So as Aditi has already introduced my, at least the topic, traveling in the cosmos, exploring the urban sensibility amongst the rural cosmopolitans in Hyderabad, India. Albeit it's a bit wordy, I'm sure that we'll get to the bottom of these terms that I've used and in what context I have used them. But to begin with, I would just like to give a brief context as to what brought me to this idea to begin with. While I was working as an independent researcher in Hyderabad, associated with the Urban Lab, I came across quite a few Bengali migrant laborers in the part of the city where I was staying. And I noticed that they don't really stick to that format of labor moving to another from one state to other just for work. They had in some way a certain livelihood pattern which kind of got my interest. And I started hanging out with them. I started interacting with them, spending some time. And in the days to come, I kind of embedded myself in their surrounding to try to find out more about them. And thereafter, I kind of went through some literature to kind of realize what I was actually getting at. So what's at stake? What are we talking about here? I think a lot of us in who have done sort of secondary research on labor migration will come up with this sort of basic definition that it's a process of alleviating economic distress or moving from the urban to the from rural to urban in terms of a better livelihood. But what really went through my mind all this while looking at these particular laborers from Bengal, from where I come from, was that are these laborers moving only because of particular incentives related to economic means, or was it something else? Will they keep moving if they have work in their immediate vicinity? Because there are many cities from where these people can work, from where they can get seasonal work, even if they are farmers in other seasons. So that is kind of what brought me to this idea. And when I kind of embedded myself in amongst them and did my field work, I went back to this idea of rural cosmopolitanism and tried to understand if that idea from around 2 decades back fit in this context and what more could one achieve out of it. So just to give you a brief understanding of rural cosmopolitanism as coined by Gidwani and Shiv Ramakrishnan, would be that in their essay titled Circular Migration and Rural Cosmopolitanism in India, Gidwani and Shiv Ramakrishnan gives an alternative picture than what most labor economists have been rallying around for decades about rural to urban migration. They talk about what happens when people move out of their rural abodes, work in the urban centers, and they go back to their roots. Roots here meaning rural places. And they keep doing this process in a circular manner. And the changes that can be seen, who they become, more importantly, who they want to be, like distinct from their immediate vicinity in the rural places. And that kind of triggered in me the idea of how there is an identity formation in place, how there is a rise or at least a generation of a sensibility that is taking place, which is much different from a rural or an urban, not sticking to particular binaries. And that is where I kind of tried to formulate my hypothesis, which is that these rural migrants who are moving from rural, particularly very backward villages, don't always come to the city just to earn money, but use that experience to enhance their social status and position in the community where they belong. This enhancement is due to the acquisition of symbols, signs, behaviors, practices, tendencies, which are akin to the urban in a normative way. And they practice this in their native abodes. That's when they go back. Because this is a circular migration pattern. So we have them working for a few months in cities, and then they go back in the villages. And this kind of gives rise to this idea of urban sensibility. This paper tries to test this hypothesis that this continuous circular migration results in a mixed bag of ideas, where some aspects of the rural is kept intact and some aspects is inculcated. This leads to what I call a urban sensibility, a messy amalgamation of parochial and the modern. This is building on the idea of rural cosmopolitanism, but expanding it to find out how exactly migrants perceive this travel and how it is bringing a change in their identity. So in terms of just a quick, give you a quick rundown of the method, like I said, I embedded myself in the surroundings. So I used to visit these sites, stay there, spend hours. Even though I had a detailed questionnaire, but I did not record these interviews with the recording devices because I thought it might just spook them. So I wanted to get really in-depth understanding of what they thought, what they felt, and why they were doing this migration pattern, and what is the change in the sensibility or identity. And there were informal conversations over a period of time. Now, when I started to sieve through the data, I used two different theoretical frameworks. I'll just very quickly give you a rundown of the two. One is subjective singularity. In the book Chasmosis by Felix Guattari, he talks about how there will be a sort of ambiguous or oxymoronic understanding of and sensibility taking place, which expresses national liberation, but also on the other hand, there is a call to conservative reterritorialization of subjectivity. This would give one aspect of the sensibility that I'll be talking about, and the other would be the idea of distinction that Pierre Bourdieu has theorized around 4 decades back, where he talks about social subjects classified by the classification are able to distinguish and make the distinctions they make between the vulgar and the beautiful, in which the positions in the objective classification is expressed or betrayed. So they're very careful about what would give them a higher or a lower standing, and then appropriately changing their behavior to suit that higher status. Right. So the first aspect that I found out in my paper was this idea of the footloose proletariat. That they are careful about what they want to do, but they are also moving around, knowing what they are exactly aware of. So why did they come to Hyderabad? I mean, even though it pays too little, and they could have made a lot more money back at home, but they still like to do it because it's a big city. It's a huge city. It kind of gives them that added strength, or talks about what kind of aspirations that they have. And even though they have work back at home, but they don't necessarily need to stay at home. The respondents I was speaking to, they told me about why they would rather live in the city and do labor work rather than go back to the village, because there is a social status that is associated with the city. And that kind of capital is not available in the villages. One of the respondents mentioned that how he has developed a taste, and he was mentioning that he doesn't like the food when he goes back at home, because the quality of rice that they eat at home is not as good or as much or as desirable as he wants it. And that kind of gives him the ability to make this distinction as to what he thinks is going to be according to his liking or not. I'm kind of rushing through my slides, and I apologize for that. The idea that kind of comes alternative to this liberation or the aspirational factor is the reterritorialization of subjectivity. So on one hand, while you are moving out of the village and trying to acquaint yourself with modern urban practices, I of course use these words with a bit of caution. But the idea that you will be now attuned or introduced to newer greener pastures kind of falls short, because we find that there's a nefarious collaboration between patriarchy and capital. So while you're moving out, at the same point of time, you have these archaic notions of caste, class, region, gender strongly enmeshed in your sensibility. You are the idea that women are somehow not allowed to work, or that their place is only in the household. These get very much emboldened. And in many of these conversations, these respondents told me that there's a certain attribute which can be given to women, and others will have to follow by that. And there is an anxiety at the same point of time, which is yeah, I'm going to finish with this slide. So if you can quickly go through this text, where this particular respondent tells me that she doesn't like a particular leader in the party because there are claims that she is a Muslim. So this idea, this predisposed notion that some groups are not supposed to be good enough for their liking kind of gets reinforced, even though they are in a cosmopolitan urban setting. And that is the paradoxical understanding of this rural cosmopolitan which it gives rise to. In part of the discussion, I just would like to quickly summarize that the idea of urban sensibility gives us this understanding that even though people are moving out of their parochial abodes, they are still holding on to these understandings, these archaic understandings. And this mismatch or messy amalgamation, as I point out, is somehow beyond the purview of the regular everyday policy paradigms, because they neither fall in the urban, they neither fall in the rural. They have urban aspirations, they have rural traditional and cultural imports as well. And that is why we need to kind of take into account the unplanned, or the idea that there are people in the interstices, there are contestations that take place, and somehow we need to be aware of that when we are making policies, or when we are thinking about how urban functions or who are the actors in urban? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And maybe, at the end, in the question and answers, you can share a little bit more of the voices of the people that you spoke to. But I just want to leave you with some questions that I have listening to you. I think it'd be interesting to understand from the fieldwork you've done, what is the size and scale of urban cosmopolitanism that you have studied? What are the boundaries of cityness from the people who have spoken to you, and what do you think this means in terms of employment policy, migration policy at different city scales? And perhaps you can offer us some of the voices of the research participants and when you answer this at the end. But moving on, can I invite K. Saradhambika to put your video on and start sharing your slides. We're going to be listening to a presentation titled Urban Working Women in the Organized Sector Under the Double Burden Syndrome.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. You are on mute if you're speaking. We can't hear you at the moment. For everyone listening, if you have questions for the first presenter, please do put them in a Q&A box.
Apologies. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
There seems to be some problem when I'm presenting. Sorry about the technical glitch.
No problem.
I'm just trying to switch.
Yeah, your voice has gone down. Perhaps we can't hear you right now. So maybe we can move to the next presenter and we can work on the technical issue. All right. You want to take a stab at... maybe you can start speaking and we can see if we can hear you. We can see your screen, but we cannot hear you at the moment. Okay, so Saradhambika, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen right now. And I'm going to ask Shadab Anis, if you can hear us, maybe you can start going now. And
okay.
Let me introduce you also to our audience. So he'll be presenting a presentation called Reimagining Duality of Urbanization in the New Normal, Deepening Multidimensional Marginality of Urban Poor in Neoliberal Indian Cities. So please do put your video on and do start your presentation.
Okay, so my topic has been already mentioned, so I will start my presentation. I don't have the PPT. So the process of urbanization starts with an increase in the labor of industrialization, which transforms the demographic flow of capital and expansion of a space. Urbanization does not only change the modes and means of production and consumption, but also the social, political, economic, and cultural relations in the society. The expansion of cities occurred with the decline of the devalue of agriculture production. The people who used to invest their labor in agriculture production did not get the sufficient return for their survival. With the arrival of the global capitalism, the agriculture and its allied sectors and in our industries, which culminated into migration of agriculture laborers and petty land owning class to the cities. The distress migration movements are aspirational that urban space provide better livelihood, opportunity of health, education, and of occupation. However, cities are not uniform and produce its own marginality. Slums are segregated ghettos are manifestations of such marginality. Marginality is the position of people on the edges, preventing their access to resources and opportunities, freedom of choice, and the development of personal capabilities. Being excluded not only from growth but also from the other dimension of development and societal progress is an indication of the extremely poor being at the margins of society, and in many cases marginality is root cause of poverty. It has been argued by Vrinda Chopra in 2009 The marginality as a concept is multidimensional and historical phenomena takes place in intersection of social, political, and economic sphere. The other important context of urbanization can be understood as a continuum of rural-urban, pre-colonial and colonial, pre-capitalism and capitalism formulation of caste and labor question, which is peculiar to the Indian society, and its impressions can be identified in the cities known as global cities. What Saskia Sassen argues, the contradiction of unskilled laborers absorbed in formal economy and flummification of large population of migratory people further complicates the whole romanticization of urbanization. However, the arrival of globalization breaks the caste structure in one reel as consumers, but reproduces the caste identity as citizens who seek to demand the benefits of social welfare economics, dignified livelihood on one side, and represses dual marginality by pushing them to the slums, and more than half the slum dwellers are from Dalit, tribal, and lower caste and minority communities. The paper proposes an intersectional approach as a theoretical framework to understand multidimensional marginality. The paper is qualitative in nature based on the secondary literature with some case studies from the field. So urban has been defined by the census as urban space having a population of more than 5,400 people living in per square kilometer. Density wise, 75% of population is engaged in non-agriculture work. So this is how urbanization has been defined by the government of India so far. And conceptualizing urbanization from the gaze of, it has been argued that whether we can see the urbanization from a one perspective, whether it is social, political, or sociology. So the scholars have been agreed that conceptualization of urbanization from the gaze of one discipline will not provide the complete picture, and therefore it needs multidiscipline as critical element to unearth the process and formation of cities. Urbanization as a way of life is a confluence of different aspects of political, social, economic, and cultural phenomena. It is also a new third world urban phenomena theories through the perspective of political economy and its relation with the global capital of the north. The urban has dual characters, can be understood by duality. The urban squatter settlements and gated colonies, the high salaried jobs and daily wage laborers are manifestations of urban process and grow parallelly. Wakand and Sassen Hermes argued this. This is also important to understand that even Indian cities have dual characters, which creates the state of contestation between organized middle class elites and the underclass. Devan Patel 2006 argued. It is opined that the developed world through the subcontracting of labor pushed the process and expansion of the informal sector in the developing world due to availability of cheap labor, which also produces urban marginality at multi-layered. Coming to the current, defining the process and the duality in the urbanization, coming to the current COVID crisis and its impact on the poor. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the life the humans used to live, and the world was stressed. Complete closure of financial exchange, curfews were placed, and movement were restricted to curtail the deadly effects of this pandemic. In India, the executives were busy in hiding the data of the and mismanagement, while the people were helpless, seeing their loved one dying due to utter shortage of health infrastructures and other measures. In this crisis, life was in distress, but the poor of both urban and rural urban areas were more vulnerable. Loss of income and employment disruptions in social protection schemes, for instance, mid-day meal PDS hospitals were burdened of hardship more than on urban and rural poor. It is been argued by United Nations. Uh, and how this has been persist the duality and the binary of urban societies. The middle class and urban bourgeoisie elites were in stress too, but they started work from home and also consuming arts and aesthetics, what Harvard talks about, while while the while the urban poor was consistently struggling for their survival. This is how the duality of cities persist, and it put the cities in the binary. On the other hand, placing binary of urbanization as a process of accumulation of capital and production of space, the right to the cities for the all were collective consumption as defining feature of urban theories. The pandemic breaks the binary of duality and goes beyond it in two different ways. It affected the urban elites in many ways, and money in many ways, and their class positionality could not buy them the access to beds, oxygen, etc., and disruptions in getting labor of the poor as domestic help, security guards, gardener, etc. Now I am giving the two case studies here during my fieldwork, which I have just completed for my PhD. So in one of the slums, which is just has been included in urban municipal corporation at Patna. So I was doing a focus group discussion. So there were few ladies who talked that the government is continuously arguing about the hygiene and to keep hygiene and cleanliness, but it is really unfortunate to say that we do not have access to water and sanitation. So how we are going to manage this? We rarely have bath in 4 or 5 days because there is a one hand pump and most of the time it is not working. We spend our whole money from our pocket to get it fixed. So see, continuously raising the questions of sanitation and the other basic needs which directly affects the life of the people, urban poor during COVID. The second important aspect, the effects of COVID on the family. The other important aspect which have been shared by two children, the siblings Raja and Raja and Jhilmil, earlier 10 and 7 years of old. Earlier they used to study in a private school. Right now, due to some depth in the family, so they are now working as a child labor. And Raja says that my father has said that once we are out of this debt, I will re-enroll you in a school. So he's very passionate about study, both Raja and Jilmil. But unfortunately, this is how the COVID has affected the urban poor, where the children are out of school, dropped out, and now compelled to work as a child labor. There are some data from the United Nations that how this urban COVID has further going to increase 40 to 66 million children in extreme poverty, and there how the loss of learning has been taken place. But still, at the end, I will conclude by saying the urban spaces are dual in nature, and this dualization is continuously increasing. The gap has been further widened by the COVID-19 and loss of job, which effects on income. The socialist democratic then state failed to provide a dignified life to the poor. Continuous eviction without rehabilitation at one side and expansion of cities and facilities produce resources and consume finished goods become the site of profit in neoliberal cities. Even their rights are not defended by the custodian of it, the courts. The Indian state failed to provide decent work and wage, housing, education, and denies right to the city. The production of space for the market have been consumed by few and displaces others. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think, your work comes at a very difficult moment again with the rise in cases, and you've, spoken to us about the relationship between COVID and the different forms of dispossession and vulnerability that exist in our cities and the kind of divided cities that we have. I wonder from your research, if you can share, what you think are the interrelated factors and interventions that can go into actually changing some of this. What does it look like to bring about a change that comes from people asking for different kinds of resources? So thank you very much for that. And I'm going to ask SriPallavi to come back online and start her presentation. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, Saradhambika. Many apologies to you, SriPallavi. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And apologies for the tech glitch earlier. I hope you're able to see the presentation and hear me and see me.
Yes, absolutely. Both.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity to everybody. And I think the technical glitch helped me a little bit because it was rightful opportunity that the previous speaker did touch upon urbanization and some of what I would be going through as well in the presentation. The title is Are Urban Working Women in the Organized Sector Under the Double Burden Syndrome? And this thought stemmed from my own experience of having been working in an organized sector for close to 25 years. and looking at all the family members and my colleagues and peers who have been working, and all the discussions we've had. And that made me realize that it is time for me to convert some of this into research area and see how we can bring about some thoughts for collective workforce to think about and see if we can have any conclusions. So the paper is intended to be bringing out some of probably what is unconscious thinking and make it intentional to solve for some of what we see day in and day out. If you move on to the next slide, please. And thanks to the IHS committee for helping me with the presentation. So this is a very common funnel we might have seen in many studies, Harvard Business Reviews, Economic Times, wherever we speak of women in the workforce. But there's an important point I wanted to call out, which says in a population of 1.37 billion Indians, 48% is women, which is like very, very huge number. And of that, the education rate is pretty high. It's not abysmally low as is expected. It is 64.63%, which is again pretty high. But when it comes to workforce participation of all these educated women and the uneducated, the overall participation rate is only 25.51%. When we look at male workers, yes, it's pretty high. It's in the range of 53. But that is where the concept of binary stems in, because for the male workforce, it is pretty much the same, except in decimals, like 53.24 and 53.16 is the difference between rural and urban. Whereas for women, the rural workforce is split into 30% and urban is only 15.4% of the total working women. And in that, again, if you look at self-employed women versus women in non-organized sector and women in organized sector, self-employment rates are very high to the point of 30% again for rural women, and urban, it is pretty less, right? And then if you also generally look at leading these companies or corporates or organized sectors where they're actually the decision makers, so-called C-level execs, it is hardly 3.7%. Bottom line, of the 1.37 billion Indians, of which close to 50% are women, only 5% is their employment rate. So where are all these educated women? What are all they doing? How are they sustaining? Especially in the urban areas where the numbers are tapering. If you could move to the next slide, please. This is a graph from statistical institutes, and this clearly shows the urban workforce LFPR, labor force participation rate, is pretty much like, it seemed to peak in early 2004, 2005, but it's pretty much flat with a very, very small rise. Now, with growing economy, opportunities and education is being high, we would expect, that's normal economic trend, is that you will have more job opportunities, we will have more women, which means we will have more women in the workforce. But India is one of the countries that has an opposing trend. The LFPR of women is lower than that of men, and that's across, irrespective of whether you take a rural cut or an urban cut. If you go to the next slide, please. So much has been said and written, right, about gender inequality in workforce, gender wage gap, infrastructure gap, facilities, education, availability of job itself. But let's talk about those who have the jobs. And this is a picture I just really liked of probably somebody in a company, corporate, or an organized sector where they have broken the so-called glass ceiling. This 5% of women working population in the urban sector, they are very respected, very inspiring to others. That is where most role models are. And the belief is they have broken the glass ceiling, they have unshackled themselves, they have broken all the roadblocks and overcome all of them to be the working women, to be well paid, and to be a have-it-all individual. Is this perception true? Let's take a simple example. Like, I'm a working professional, I have a young kid, I take care of my aging parents, and I do have a support, say, of a maid, childcare, and I'm financially independent. My maid is also working in the unorganized sector, so to say, and she comes from rural parts. She has 3 daughters, she works in 5 houses, she comes twice a day to my place, and she's financially independent. So what's the difference between the two of us? Is she better off or am I better off? It's just the perception. If you go to the next slide. So some of the questions that come to mind are: urban educated Indian women more likely to join the workforce compared to their rural counterparts? At least statistically, the answer seems to be a no. Do the working women have no challenges since they have overcome it all? and all the gender gap, apart from the pay gap that we speak about, are all of it mostly in rural? The answer again seems to be a no, and I'll share how and why. Is it true that the urban educated upper class women seek work only for personal satisfaction because they have everything else set in their life? And the primary reason for why rural poor women work is to generate income for their house and have their basic needs met? Do all urban areas in India have a higher participation rate in the workforce? And this may seem rhetoric, but these are the questions we have to ask ourselves, because statistically the answers to all these questions are an outright no. If you go to the next question, so the Indian Public Affairs Center conducted a case study about what could be the barriers and enablers to decent work for Indian women. And their preliminary findings are actually published in an article in Southern Voice that actually talks about a nuanced picture of a rural and urban divide. If participants are interested and our audience is interested, I would really encourage them to go through that. It's very, very insightful. It is again known and proven and captured in census everywhere that majority of Indian women, specifically in rural areas, suffer from social cultural discrimination, called out in research done by Roy and with you as well. But does it end there? The unemployment rates over the years have been increasing for urban women. It's a 13.9% rate right now. And these are with women who are educated, who have minimum a graduation degree and above. And 90% of the women who are living in urban India, aged 15 plus, which is the prime workforce starting 18 to say 30, first, they are not working. Two, they are not actively seeking work. Three, nor are they willing to work in the corporates or organized sectors. Why is that so? None of the major urban cities in India was found to have a female workforce population rate above the 50th percentile ever. So if you go to the next slide, what I would like to call out is there are factors, and next slide please, there are factors that are actually probably playing out across rural and urban, the same reasons. Inequalities in education and health. Yes, graduation is there, but who is entering the job force apart from fresh level? Health infrastructures. Are women in the urban cities also working more and more in terms of putting in more time, more effort, etc.? Discrimination and harassment at workplace. Yes, it is true that there is harassment and sexual discrimination more so in the rural areas because of patriarchal, but does it not hold true for women in workforce? There are lots of sexual harassment cases in the workforce as well. Childcare, which is a very, very important portion of life of a working woman, state infrastructure definitely needs to be improved. So this is one where the state policies and systems and our legal and government systems can help us. But apart from that, there's an ask for society as well. If you go to the next slide. Women and socio-cultural factors. We still have the patriarchal system that has been entrenched so much that irrespective of all that I said, let's assume all that is also taken care of. We have probably created a second shift problem for all the working women to do some unpaid work at home. And the 3 C's seems to be common expectation of cooking, cleaning, and caring. And caring doesn't have to be children. Caring for pets, caring for seniors, caring for elders, caring for patients. No matter the age or income, women still have the primary responsibility for housework and childcare. And this has been called out in the survey where I surveyed about 305 working women of Indian origin. And the answer is outright close to 98%. This answer seems to be true, where we have created a 2 shifts. Next slide. And there are socio-perception factors of sarcasm. The new acronym I learned was DINKS, double income, no kids. The expectation is then you're moving ahead. And if you have kids and you have family to take care of, you have to put your career behind. These are images of how women are perceived at work. If you look at a person, 2 women talking, perception is gossiping, and you have to overcome that perception. That's not the same for men. If you look at a woman traveling, if it's a man traveling, yes, they're advancing their career. If a woman decides to travel for work, it is irresponsibility towards home. If a man's desk is very clear, they are very responsible. But for a woman, its family is more important than the career or vice versa. If the cluttered is there, man's desk is cluttered, it seems to be busy and hardworking. But for a woman, it seems to be disorganized. Why are these perceptions? And with these perceptions, how much roadblock do we have to get into day in and day out work? Next slide. So bottom line, socio-cultural policies, everything put together, The conclusions are very, very stark. I would also like to note that even though these women are working and earning, is it true that they have economic independence to make decisions regarding, say, financial investments, regarding child rearing, regarding changing jobs, regarding quitting jobs, and they are still only codependent? Last slide. Irrespective of whether we are urban or rural, irrespective of where we are, women in this country do not enjoy equal rights like men in all fields, whether it is home, social function, financial decisions, employment, primarily stemming from our traditional value systems and norms and patriarchal attitudes, which will take longer to move towards. Mere access to education and employment can accelerate, and it's no doubt we have accelerated quite a bit. Is that enough to achieve our goal? No, we seem to need to change our attitude and move away from the perceptions of rural and urban binary and truly plan for an inclusive and sustainable growth of women in Indian workforce to answer the question, will women be a part of India's future workforce? And if yes, what big a role will they play? Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Saradhambika, for your presentation. I think you've done a really great job of giving us, a broad scoping of how this area has been looked at, studied, how many interventions have tried to take place in this area, trying to get more women into the workforce, but then eventually failed, and we persist with these trends and patterns. I would love to hear at the end a little bit more about the methods you used. You mentioned that you surveyed 305 working women, and obviously these are women who have engaged in the workforce. So it would be great to hear about empirically what their barriers to growth have been, and how we can kind of work backwards from that to understand how to get more women in the formal sector. So thank you so much for that. Next, I will ask SriPallavi to start her presentation, which is on Beyond Internal and International Migration, Exploring Everyday Spatiality of Indian Women Migrants in Hyderabad and Melbourne.
Thank you, Aditi. I'll just quickly share my screen. So hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel today and presenting together with these amazing panelists. So today I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've done for my doctoral research, and I'll talk about my attempt to go beyond internal and international migration by exploring the everyday specialities of Indian women migrants in Hyderabad and in Melbourne. So this is a quick overview of my presentation. I'll give a quick introduction to the context and research objectives, but I'll focus mainly on the methodology that I've used to look at internal and international migration along common themes, and then I'll present some of the pertinent findings from my research. So migration in the contemporary era is complex, and the reasons are multiple. Typologies of the migrants are also diverse. However, not all migrations are global, but in the migration research, there's been an increasing focus on international migration, particularly to developed nations from comparatively lesser developed nations. And the focus on gender and migration has also been limited. So in my research, I try to address some of these gaps and look at both internal and international migration along common themes. And the question that I posed was, how do migrants develop a sense of belonging with their cities? And what are the spatial dimensions of this relationship? So what migration does do is cause a relocation of the base of everyday activities. And that establishes the base link between these two. Between the migration and everyday moments. And also in today's, in the contemporary era, the relationship that migrants share with places is complex, and it extends beyond the city of origin and destination. So I wanted to explore these interlinkages further. And in order to do that, I had to look at them as varying spatiotemporal moments. That is, if I see internal or international migration as long distance, long-term, and more permanent movement, and in comparison, if everyday movements are understood as short distance, relatively shorter term, and temporary movements, then I could explore their possible interlinkages. And after looking at these different diverse spatial temporal practices of the migrant women, I wanted to understand if that has an impact on their place belonging with the cities they live in. So I interviewed internal migrant women in Hyderabad, and I also spoke to Indian women who moved to Melbourne. And I asked them about their migration experiences. I wanted to understand about their times of arrival, their reason for migration, and how have their experiences been as a migrant so far in the cities. I also wanted to understand the places that they engaged with in their cities and what were the different activities connected to these spaces and what kind of a relationship they form with them based on how they engage with them. And finally, I also asked them about their experiences of feeling at home in their new cities. But before I could operationalize my methodology in these two different social cultural contexts, first I had to assume, or rather I had to disregard any hierarchical ordering of cities. And I had to look at the dynamic complex processes that happen in the cities. And I think in the first presentation today, there was a little bit of discussion about that. And I also wanted to place emphasis on the places, and the conceptualization was based on the activities and the meanings attached to them rather than any fixed typologies. This is a quick snapshot of the participants that I interviewed. And although they had varying socioeconomic backgrounds, their profiles were consistent with the different typical migrants in the respective contexts. The women I interviewed were mostly married with children, and they were mostly Hindu women. And they had different reasons for migration. So now, in order to analyze these different spatio-temporal practices, I relied on time geography and its notational diagrams. So what time geography allows us to do is to look at the different moments in time and space for an individual, and also analyze the different processes that influence these moments. And there is a notational diagram for it. Some of the key elements are that is a time path, which essentially shows all the moments in time and space that have already occurred. And typically it shows the distance that is taken to arrive at a station or a fixed point. And these fixed point could be a community center, home, or other places in their everyday life. And the time that they spent in these particular stations can also be shown in these time paths. And when you put these different moments of in time space together, they become part of a project in life, which could be sustaining a livelihood, etc. And for me, it was about understanding the migrants' relationship with the city. But this methodology, how allowed me to adapt it to my project objectives and study different spatio-temporal moments, which I'll talk about in a bit. But my emphasis was more on practices that were repetitive in the lives of the migrants, because it helps form an attachment with the cities they live in. So I was not concerned with the exact sequence of movement or the time they spent for these different activities. So essentially, this is what the time paths look like for the participants in Hyderabad. And each of these lines represent the time paths for the women that I interviewed. I was able to show below, like the baseline, the migratory moments, the times of arrival, if it was an independent or a family migration. I was also able to show if home was used as more than a private space. So the way I represented was that migration trajectories ended at home, and that was also home was the starting point of all the everyday activities. And home was used as a place of work, as shown in the image on the left, and it was sometimes used as a communal space, say for bhajans. Like, for example, the picture on the right is from Melbourne. And then the other recurring activities that the women described in their interviews, I categorize them based on their likelihood of recurrence. Either they are likely to recur on a weekly basis, or a monthly basis, or a yearly basis. And I gave a range of distances so that I could keep this consistent across both cases, and that would help me with my analysis. So this is how my time paths for Melbourne look like. And of course, the scale that I showed for the migratory movements was slightly different, and I could also show some complex movements on these time paths as well. But to make sense of these individual moments, I translated them and spatialized them on maps. For example, Leela here is a long-term migrant in Hyderabad. And you can see from this translation that she spent most of her activities, say, going to Kirana stores or getting your rations, or everything was concentrated in around her suburb. But religion was an important part of her life. And you could see that she could travel great distances to access these cities, even outside of her city limits, if that was important to her. But of course, the frequency of recurrence varied based on different factors, one of which could be the access and availability to transport, or say, if it was a festival period or other reasons. This is an example for Priya, so she's a new migrant in Melbourne. So she was living in Melbourne for 3 years at the time of the interviews. And at the time of the interview, she explained that now that she moved as a student and she graduated, she had more time on her hands to start exploring the city beyond the suburb that she lived in. And she had friends who could drive. So her spatial movement started extending beyond the public transportation networks. This is how I could, by analyzing all these different spatial practices across both case studies, I could identify that there were mainly two types of time-space routines, either the core activities that were more frequently recurring, or restorative practices where the frequency of recurrence slightly varied. So the core activities involved trips for work, study, for essential purchases, or caregiving activities. And as Sharda has explained before me, that there is that double burden on women, and a significant amount of their routines had to do with their children or their activities related to the lives of their children. And religious practices were core activities if it was important to them. And the restorative practices could be social interactions, which could be at home or visiting friends and families within the cities and beyond, or traveling for leisure or relaxation or religion. So now, looking at these time parts, I could also get a sense of some of the factors that influence their everyday moments across both cases. And however, the impact or the interrelation between some of these factors varied for each participant, and that dependent on their individual circumstances. And as Tirthankar has already explained in the first presentation, that there are social and cultural variation that makes you undergo some changes in a new environment. And that had an impact on everyday movements. Patriarchy and protection, as was discussed in the previous presentation, also has an impact on how the women moved in their cities. Then positionality, how the women perceive themselves, their identities, or experience their identities in a new context, was an important determinant. And how they had access and availability to different transportation options, the perception of those options and their ability to drive had an impact on their movements. And also the perception of safety and the perception of boundaries, either real or not, and how they visualize certain spaces in their city created a variation in their spatial patterns. So the migration trajectories did have a relationship to the everyday movements. Migration did cause a disruption, transformation, or elimination of past practices. The initial spatial practices were closely linked to how the women were introduced to the city or by whom they were introduced to the cities. And these patterns modified with time, with everyday life experiences and life cycle changes. And as I said, positionality was an important determinant, and cultural and social expectations are often negotiated in a new context through migration. To conclude, I was able to use time geography to look at these varying spatio-temporal movements, be it internal or international, and compare them with everyday movements. And I was able to replicate this methodology and adapt it to my research questions. I was able to get insights into the organization of the women's spatial routines, and also capture the intersectional variations, not just within each case study, but also across both case studies. And I think with this, I'll conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, SriPallavi. Really interesting. Just to see the methods you've used in doing this research and the findings you've had. I wonder, in the final question and answer session, if you can think about what are the different kind of solidarities that come up that in the practices of women as they start to move, beyond, start to expand their spatialities and their mobilities? What are the forms of solidarity that enable integration into a city? And maybe we can use that as a way to reflect on if there's a role for the state or for local policy to bring some of those forms of integration and solidarity in at an earlier time to help people settle in. But thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Vrinda Chopra. So Vrinda, maybe you can get started. Her presentation is titled Mediating Social Entrepreneurship for Development in South Africa and India, Demonstrating Entanglements of Neoliberal Economic Logics and Social Missions. So please go ahead and start your presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, Aditi. Just give me a second. So my presentation is visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Vrinda Chopra. I recently completed examination for my PhD at the University of Cape Town, and I'll be drawing on evidence from my thesis to sort of which was on mediating social entrepreneurship in South Africa and India. And the focus is to draw out the entanglements of neoliberal logics and social missions. A quick context, to give you a quick context, both South Africa and India are post-colonial emerging economies, and they draw on neoliberal economic policies heavily, which means that they incentivize the private sector to invest in development initiatives. Specifically in India, this primarily takes place through the Companies Act, which has mandated CSR spending on poverty alleviation, education, health services, etc. And in South Africa, they have a flagship Black economic empowerment policy, which directly incentivizes enterprise development through private sector investment. So the emphasis on entrepreneurship is very explicit in South Africa and kind of implicit in India, but also through many other policies quite prominent. This throws up certain theoretical issues in understanding social entrepreneurship in emerging economies like South Africa and India. These are basically, on one end, are popular views that combining economic logics of markets and finance with social missions can efficiently and effectively address complex development issues such as unemployment, inequality, etc. On the other hand, are critics who sort of speak to this idea that entrepreneurial approaches are neoliberal tools. They further the hegemony of neoliberalism through poverty management rather than focusing on poverty alleviation specifically. The view that I take in this paper and in my thesis is really that both these broad perspectives, they reify the importance and the centrality of economic logics rather than seeing it in relation to social ones. And the implications of that is that there are stalemates in analysis. You're not able to explore the possibilities of generative analysis that or data that lies in between these broad perspectives. To embed this into the subject matter of my of the paper, I looked at the meso in-between scale of mediation. These include organizations like incubators, accelerators, networking platforms, etc. And they lie in between the macro perspectives that emphasize financial and market logics through state policies or philanthropic funding, etc. And at the other end are the complex micro realities of social practice that throws up issues of trust, morality, the kind of impact enterprises are having, and so on. So the mediation scale was really fertile ground to be able to see the interactions that take place between different scales and between different types of logics. So as I already mentioned, the aim of the paper was to draw attention and deepen understanding of the entangled realities that shape social entrepreneurship practice in South Africa and India. I'll specifically be drawing on evidence from pilot incubation programs, the one in South Africa that addresses unemployment based on their economic empowerment policy. And in India, it's about raising investment for addressing issues of dignified livelihoods for artisans. So a brief note on methodology. The PhD was based on an ethnography of the meso in-between scale of mediation. I looked at intermediaries that were directly setting up and growing enterprises. I drew on purposive sampling techniques to define and narrow down on the intermediaries I was looking at. And the focus of the analysis was really to unearth the underlying narratives that drive everyday practice of mediation. So with that, I'll move on to my data. I'll first look at a pilot incubation program of OnShare in Johannesburg, South Africa. In the work of OnShare, you could see how they were navigating in their impact, their own growth as an intermediary, and implementation issues of community or building community trust. OnShare, just to give you a little bit of a background, OnShare was an intermediary working in urban townships that had apartheid era spatial segregation, and which was continuing till date. So they were working in these townships on building entrepreneurial skills of school children initially. And based on their own needs for financial sustainability, they diversified their program, drawing on the CSR funds that were available because of South Africa's flagship economic policy. In implementation, they faced a lot of trust issues, even though they had an existing presence in many of these townships. I'll explain this quickly through a few instances or a broad perspective on the processes of the funders and the views the entrepreneurs held. So the corporate funder had promised 10,000 rands to all participants, but they had due diligence processes in place. They wanted to ensure that the participants were using the resources responsibly. At the other end were the entrepreneurs who were talking about the disappointment that they've felt through many programs that have come and gone. And this entrepreneur is really talking about how they'll have to wait and see what comes out of this particular program. And given these two broad things, it translated into practice where an entrepreneur, a promising entrepreneur, needed funding for buying certain resources for her enterprises and to grow her enterprise. And the due diligence processes of the funder were causing a lot of delays in terms of being able to provide those funds to the entrepreneur. There was a danger of the entrepreneur dropping out of the program. So as an intermediary, the CEO had to take quick decisions to ensure that they don't lose a promising entrepreneur, as that would have affected the social impact that they are able to show at the end of the program. What this ended up being was that the decision-making processes of the intermediary was driven not simply by this idea that they need to make sure that the funds are used responsibly, but the fact that it had a social impact that they were concerned about in terms of addressing employment in those areas. So the work of OnShare can really be seen as strung out between different layers of different logics and concerns. At times they were identifying with the processes of the funder. At other times they needed to navigate those processes in such a way, even circumvent them, to ensure that the needs of the entrepreneurs on the program were being met. So their resolutions of the decision-making processes could not really be reduced to rational neoliberal sort of calculations. Building on this data, I'll look at a Masters in Impact Entrepreneurship program that was basically an incubation program held over 2 years in Bangalore, India. And in their work, you can really see the ongoing overlaps of design, impact, and business. The master's program was located in a design school called Dhwani, and the aim was really to create a professional layer of social entrepreneurs to support the livelihoods of grassroots artisans. What this meant was creating market linkages, ensuring the quality of the products the artisans were making, their branding, their access to different types of markets through those social enterprises. So the focus was on bridging design, market, and social impact considerations on an ongoing basis. The way they did this in terms of teaching was combining practical implications or practical sort of teaching methodologies with the sort of academic and theoretical concerns. In one instance, early on in the program, the convener held simulated sessions where a real life investor could come to and engage with the students. The students could pitch their ideas to the investor, and the investor could give them feedback like a real life investor would in terms of the market viability and the possibility of their enterprise to raise investment. At the end of this session, some of the social entrepreneurs on the program were a bit disillusioned. As one of them said, I think it was a bit unfair, some of the things he said. He doesn't know enough about my idea or the context. So navigating these two sort of broad ideas that don't seem to sort of come together, the founder realized that there's the need to bridge them, and reflection, processes of reflection, one-on-one sessions with students was a way to do it. So he opened up spaces for reflection that allowed the students to look at the design considerations, the practical implications of their design, as well as the social impact possible in terms of the employment for the artisans, addressing the livelihood concerns. And these ongoing practices of reflection was really for adaptation, for coming up with alternative outcomes, for embracing the messy realities of practice, because and in this case, it wasn't simply that the investors' needs need to be taken into account, but if the idea or the enterprise does not have market viability, the implications would be felt by the artisans that the enterprises were aiming to support. And so again, a lot of these decision making, these in-between spaces, these messy realities of practice could not be reduced to neoliberal economic logics in decision making and mediating. So coming back quickly to the initial frame of entangled realities, intermediaries both in South Africa and India are working in an environment that is set by national and international policy. Focusing just on these broad perspectives would reify and does reify the hegemony of neoliberal logics of market and finance. Whereas we know that at the micro level of practice, there are a lot of complex, nuanced, and relevant issues that come up and that need to be taken into account. But a high level of looking at only the micro realities of practice can lead to parochialism and narrow thinking about development goals or development challenges, rather, which are very systemic in nature. So it's really at the scale of the intermediaries that you're able to view the dialectical complexity that exists between different logics and scales. Finally, to conclude then, the idea is really to move beyond these binaries of micro, macro, economic, social, but really start thinking about and unpacking the multiple layers that exist in social entrepreneurship practice in emerging economies of the global South, like South Africa and India. And the specific contribution of the paper is really in challenging the association of social entrepreneurship as either a panacea of development solutions or a trope for furthering neoliberalism's hegemony, because both of these perspectives center economic logics. And it does this by drawing attention to the relational power dynamics that exist between economic and social logics, and it articulates the pluralities in approaches and practice of mediation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vrinda, for your presentation. As we enter into our, we have about just over 15 minutes for a question and answer session. And there have been great questions already on Zoom that have been answered. And perhaps, Vrinda, I can ask you a question, then we can work backwards from our panelists. But really fascinating presentation. And just in, being embedded in Bangalore, there is a way in which you start to hear about different forms of value that have priority when it comes to, say, the tech industry or different kinds of businesses like that. So in the various models of social entrepreneurship that you have studied, how does value get distributed? Financial value, economic value, social value, given that these firms are trying to build some kind of developmental intervention as part of it. How do investors react in terms of measuring value, and how does that kind of impact the business in that sense? And does your work then have an implication also for how entrepreneurship should be taught or framed in management or design schools?
Thanks, Aditi. That's a great question. I think what's important to remember is that the idea of the research was not to discount power dynamics that exist between market logics and social ones. There are definitely power dynamics. And as I'll draw on the work of Srila Roy to say that there aren't really these autonomous spaces or these pure spaces outside the realm of the market or finance that exist, and that where you can see that it's only the social missions that drive action. In the case of social enterprises, there are specific issues of focusing on successful exits and mission drifts that take place. Those are very, very real threats. I think the implications of the research is really in being able to draw attention that the power even of those economic logics are negotiated in a relational aspect. So if there's an issue of trust that as the presentation that comes up, you really need to think about it as even if your goal is certain kinds of financial logics, financial sustainability, will you be able to reach it if you don't have social impact? And so I don't have an answer to your question on how this gets measured on a regular basis, because I think most of the enterprises or intermediaries I looked at were struggling with that issue. And they came up with a lot of different approaches that worked very specific to their work. But that's a good direction for future research to probably take to figure out what kind of approaches. A few things that come to mind are design thinking, systems thinking. Those are the frames that they were using. So,
Thank you so much. I think maybe we can move on to SriPallavi. SriPallavi, you had a question in the Q&A box that you answered. So maybe I can actually extend that great question that Aruna Raman asked and
Sure.
Extend it to saying, what do you think the more fluid versions of legality and illegality in Indian cities as implications for migrants mean for the strategies and solidarities that they create? And Aruna's question as well on whether the legal status of being a migrant kind of shapes the way people are able to use space and move around space in Melbourne.
Sure. So I did try and answer that question. So the legal aspects were a little bit more intricate or a little complex in both cities. For example, like I said, in Melbourne, it's about their visa status, whether they were more permanent visa holders or temporary visa holders, and that gave them a sense of a permanency or a security. And since my focus was on understanding the sense of belonging, this did have an impact on how they wanted to develop a relationship with the cities and how they do it. And I didn't necessarily see the correlation between the legal status and the solidarity as such, but I can talk about how the migration happens because they have those networks already in the place, and then they continue to form these networks to support one another. In Melbourne, it is about forming, these being part of cultural organizations that help out each other and support one another. And in Hyderabad, it's about knowing people of the same language and culture. Then you know where to identify places that you're eat food that you're comfortable buying, or places that or rather going to temples that you're more familiar with, and that kind of a relationship that I saw in terms of building solidarity and helping them form a relationship. And these social relationships had a big impact on how they started to form a relationship with their city. I didn't cover the legal statuses in Hyderabad. And in Hyderabad, it was more about, are they able to establish their, their proof of address, and do they have access to any local identification? And I didn't go a lot into it, but I just could kind of scratch the surface of it, and there is that scope to explore further into how that manifests. But I could see that enable, if they had access to a local identification, or it made them feel somewhat a part of the cities they're moving, especially for women who did not speak a local language and came from cities that were much further away, or from places that were much further away. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that question, but.
No, absolutely. Really interesting how you've even treated the two different groups of migrants, and I think says a lot about your topics. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions for the panelists? I'd ask the audience to keep writing in as you have been. Shadab, I'd like to ask you a question. You spoke to us a lot about the deepening multidimensional vulnerabilities and marginalities of the urban poor. Shadab, can you hear me? Can you come? Would you be able to put your video on?
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to understand, what has been your method in studying this, and can you tell us a little bit about how your method relates to the study of marginalized people?
So basically, my study is focused on, so it is related to the status of children living in slums, educational status of children living in slums. So there are two components of my study. The first is the urban poor, and then it is the education status. So methodology, I have just completed my data collection last week only in 8 different slums of Patna. And so I have used the two sets of tools. The first was a very close-ended questionnaire survey method for knowing the socio-economic profile of the households, and the second, what is the current educational status of the children, whether they are going dropout, and in basically yes or no. And then in the second round, basically using the mixed method approach, in the second round I went for some of the in-depth interviews of households, and then the focus group discussions, and obviously the observations. So these were, and I have done 200, almost 220 household surveys and 50 in-depth interviews. And in every slums, because in most of the slums it happens that focus group discussion likely to take place more. So these were my methodology. So still I am figuring in the very earliest stage. I haven't started the data, the interpretation analysis of data. But the 2-3 important aspects which has come out, the first is there is a continuous contestation between the slum dwellers and the state regarding their eviction and rehabilitation in Patna. There are a few civil writ petitions have been filed. They have won the civil writ petitions for rehabilitation, but still they are struggling to get their rehabilitation for more than 10 years, 12 years, and so on. And the second, during the pandemic, there were continuous demands of, especially the public distribution systems, the rations and all. The huge discrepancy have been shared by the slum dwellers to me during my data collection. So very early stage, I do not say, but yeah. So this is how. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. SriPallavi, if I can ask you to, you had some very interesting questions that have come up in the Q&A. If you could just turn your video on. Oh, sorry, I meant Saradhambika. My apologies. I was just reading the questions. So on the female labor force participation question, I think we've gotten two interesting questions. One is that our notions of work seem to be changing by force. That there is this idea of flexible work, and we already know empirically that a lot of women do work informally, and that's why we don't see them showing up in the formal sector. So maybe you can tell us from your from the empirical work you have, what are women's voices and narratives telling you about the state of formal work and how it matches women's lives?
Sure, thanks. Yes, as I was trying to call out, I think thanks for the great questions, and some of it I will hopefully take forward in the other portions of research, because it's the paper I carved out from my larger research. So to give some context, right now, as I said, the population is women population that I have surveyed, but since we have men in the same ecosystem, I have extended the survey to all men in workplace as well, with the same questions to see how would they answer the same questions on decision making, interviewing, day-to-day work, and what would they do, or how would they support a woman in their family tomorrow if they are not already working, the next generation women. So I've opened up the survey to men right now, which is open. So I will see how close or how different the perspectives are from the women respondents. To answer your specific question on work, yes, the definition seems to be slightly shifting in terms of some informal work or unpaid work in the past getting more and more into formal work force, with new roles, new jobs getting created. That said, most companies, or at least many companies, I should say, today have a lot of their HR systems policies in place, following all the legal governance that have been put up, which means safety is taken care of to help them better. Flexibility is offered more and more as we look at more, specifically during the pandemic. There have been lots of flexible, whether it's flexible hours, part-time, full-time, flexibility to work from location of choice. Irrespective of that, the narrative or the ceiling which we have seems to be very similar in terms of within what I work, the empowerment to take decisions, the empowerment to be leading independently, the empowerment to make decisions at home, because those don't change. Whether I'm buying a car, irrespective of how much I earn, whether it's a part-time income or a monthly income, the decision that I make about where should I buy a house, when should I have a kid, where should I live, when should I shift a job, those are life decisions which are not impacted about basis the flexibility. But so there are some things that continue to have irrespective of the flexibility offered at work. There are decisions like whether to stay in job, move out, move into self-employment, etc., which do come from some of the flexible options that are offered. That said, the primary narrative seems to be more independence, more empowerment, and more credit for what they are as individuals.
Okay, great. And there's a question that has just come in that's actually quite interesting, which is asking you to speak about how these trends in female workforce are differentiated across different sectors, and what does this mean for women in STEM and for other sectors? Is it operationalized differently?
In the interest of time, I'll take a quick answer. So women in STEM discourse, if you see, there's a lot of work done in terms of getting the next generation women educated. The problem India faces, as I said, is opposite. The number of women doctors, the number of women engineers, the number of women professionals are actually pretty high. But the drop-off rates is also equally high, especially due to the socio-economic or socio-cultural ask that when a woman gets married and move to the place where the husband works, especially if it is international, these women lawyers, these women doctors, these women financial professionals have to go through a certification again. While that is true for all genders, the number of women who are having to do this, because all of these are designed by location where they stay, the Indian legal system, the Indian chartered accountancy system or taxing system, the Indian medical system, have all to be upgraded, which is causing a dip or a break period for women to actually take a break, get settled, and then come back. If you really talk about professionals where the educational background is required. If it is an MBA, it seems to be easier. So I would not say STEM as an education, but what needs to be done is look at more enablement for folks in STEM to continue in the workforce sustainably? Women scientists, women engineers, how are they being supported when the perception is engineers get ideas in the middle of the night? I don't even know if that is true. Probably that itself is a topic for research. The expectation is for a scientific invention or a eureka moment to happen like early morning, 4 a.m. maybe. So when these are perceptions, how do we build these sustainably becomes more and more the question versus education. Across different sectors, thanks for that question. IT and finance seems to be doing better than manufacturing and core manufacturing or core engineering like civil engineering.
Okay.
Right. Road, how many women who are civil engineers have moved into a desk job because they cannot, or they are not, it's not they cannot, I mean, they are not deemed fit to be standing, where the actual bridge construction is happening, or agriculture, tractor work. So while there are people who are educated, it is workforce that needs more sustainable ecosystem and infrastructure there. Infrastructure is getting built more and more for
Thank you
desk
so
jobs.
much for that. I think I'll just, because we have just 2 minutes left before we close, I'll just ask our first presenter, Tirthankar. I asked you a question in the beginning, and I think I have a little bit of a different question for you now, and you've answered many in the Q&A, but I wonder if you can help us understand this really amazing embedded grounded research in the context of some of the larger questions we have about the Indian economy and employment, right? So we talk about a demographic dividend, we talk about a lot of young people who need jobs, and we talk about a lot of jobless growth. And we've seen during the pandemic that the quality of work being offered in the labor market is not decent, it is not full-time, and we kind of left the dignity question out of that altogether. So given the kind of research you're doing on this notion of aspiration, how does that fit into those larger discourses?
Right. When I was writing this particular paper or my dissertation to begin with, the idea at the back of my mind was, does it even make sense when we're talking about a pandemic? I mean, can people really take into effect aspiration and social status and upward mobility when it comes to just feeding a stomach? And I was somehow reminded of the fact that there have been multiple times when we have had crisis in different parts of the country, where we have imagined that the same systems will not function, but they have. So just to give you one example, there was this movement against migrants in Maharashtra, Mumbai specifically, around, I think it has been there for a couple of decades. It has been that movement of migrant laborers from UP or Bihar to Maharashtra or Mumbai has been seen not in good light. But irrespective of the fact, and there has been time when those patterns have endured sort of a slow decline, we have seen that the numbers have gone back to a greater proportion again. Similarly, during the pandemic, what I came to realize when I kind of spoke to some other people, some other laborers in Bengal, I realized that the idea has shifted. For some, their whole notion that they could move with families for a short time, that has now completely evaporated. Now the idea is to move alone. So whatever little room there was for families to move, it has now completely vanished. And now the idea that let me go to city for a few days and then come back, that thing has also evolved. As far as dignity is concerned, I don't think there ever was. I mean, the whole idea that they are laborers has always been there. So just to give you one, because you talked about the ethnographic example, just to give you one small example, I was traveling in a bus. This was an AC bus in Hyderabad. There are different types of buses. The AC one is the most expensive one. For some reason, I was traveling on it, and a group of laborers got on the bus, and the bus conductor immediately comes to them and he says that, well, this is an AC bus, and where do you want to go? So they said, I want to go here and here. And the conductor immediately says, but this is going to cost you this much money. And they say, yeah, we know that. He said, yeah, but not for all of you. Each one of you have to pay this amount. And they say, yeah, we know that. The fact that they are laborers, but at the same point of time, they do demand a certain amount of rights or respect or dignity. It kind of also runs parallel to the ideas of the anxiety that the city also tries to portray. So these are the contestations that I was talking about earlier. And also the unplanned or the disruptive part of development that we get to see in the city space.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So we're just a few minutes over time, but I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your work with us and for the audience for asking really detailed, deep questions. There have been some really excellent questions that have been asked. And this wraps up our session looking at livelihoods and mobilities in cities for this year's Urban Arc. So thank you to everyone for joining. Just want to let you know that we will take a lunch break now and reconvene at 2:30 for a session on rethinking spatiality, moving beyond the urban, that's chaired by my colleague Sudeshna Mitra, which promises to be a really exciting session. So do come back at 2:30, and thank you all for participating and joining.